So according to my clock, it's 7:45. It's 35. Just a moment, I'm getting some feedback. Last week we did the first part of this two-part series, talking about one part of the story of Judaism in the last century has been the coming together of different traditions and different ways of doing things. And one of those is reflected in the language. There's been a general move away from the traditional Ashkenazi way of pronouncing, even among Jews who are from that community, to pronouncing things according to what you would call either the Sephardi or the modern Israeli way of saying things. And last week we looked at responsa of Rabbi Yitzhak Herzog about how communities can deal with that, and what sort of halakhic issues does it bring up. Since we went from Ashkenaz to Sephardi last week, I thought for the second class we would go the other way. We would look at a rabbi who had to struggle with the phenomenon of people who grew up speaking with a Sephardi accent or a Sephardi pronunciation, either because they were Sephardim themselves or they grew up in Israel, where it was standard for people to be brought up in the modern Israeli or Sephardi pronunciation. We'll get to this individual in a minute. First, I just wanted to point out that this is something that we still see in our synagogues, this diversity of pronunciation. That this is the same card, and I took this from our chapel. And so on one side it has the Ashkenazi pronunciation for the blessings of the Torah. On the second side it has the Sephardi side. So you have freedom to choose when you come up for an aliyah and you want to use the transliteration to guide your pronunciation. What we're going to be focusing on today is one word in this, and this is the word I'm highlighting here on the Ashkenazi side, Adonai, the name of how we say the tetragrammaton. And for the Sephardi pronunciation, Adonai. And a controversy arose about which way Ashkenazim should say that, or even whether people who even use the Sephardi pronunciation for everything else, whether they should say Adonai like the Ashkenazim and not Adonai like the Sephardim. I'm sure this seems to be a very minor thing, but I want to show you how it's how it could be taken by some to be a substantial halakhic issue. And this just shows you the differences in pronunciations, Adonai versus Adonai. They're really there's no difference in the way that they're spelled. Both of them are spelled with the large kametz, but but as I said, Sephardim Adonai, Ashkenaz Adonai. The meaning of this is important to understand the controversy. So I just wanted to review. The Hebrew, that the meaning of these. The singular is very easy, Adoni. If you just want to say my Lord, if you want to say Mr. Adoni, my Lord, my Master. Adonai with patach, and it's pronounced Adonai whether it's Ashkenaz or Sephardi, because the patach and the yod go to an I. whatever tradition you have, Adonai is the plural, my lords. And for both of these two, there's no difference in the pronunciation, whether they're pronounced by somebody from the Sephardi tradition or somebody from the Ashkenazi tradition. The controversy comes when we have it written with a kametz, with a vowel that looks like the little cross. And if you remember that the difference between Ashkenaz and Sephardim is that Ashkenaz pronounce this vowel as an O. So when you combine the O with the Yud, you get the diphthong Oi, like Oy vey. So the Ashkenazim pronounce it Adonai. But the Sephardim, because they do not distinguish between the kamatz and the patak, they pronounce either one as they will pronounce this Adonai and not Adonai. And so the question is, why would this ever make a difference to anyone? To give an idea how the pronunciation could become something that's ideologically charged, I'm going to take you to the 18th chapter of Bereshit, of Genesis, and this is the story of Abraham and the three angels. It starts off, Vayera elav Adonai be'elonei mamre v'hu yoshev petach ha'ohel kechom hayom. That the Lord appeared to Avram be'elonei mamre, that's a place, a shrine possibly, v'hu, and Avraham was sitting in front of his tent in the heat of the day. And of course, according to the tradition, he's recovering from his Brit Milah. And so this is a story a little bit about Bikur Kolim, the mitzvah of visiting the sick. Vayisa Aina Vayar, he raised his eyes and he saw, Vehine Shlosha Anashim Nitzavim Alav. There were these three men standing above him. Vayar, he saw, Vayarotz likratam mipetach ha'ohel. He ran to greet them from the opening of the tent, Vayishtachu arza, and he bowed before them, Vayomar Adonai, with a kamatz. And so he said, Adonai. And now the Ashkenazim would be careful to say this Adonai, and the Sephardim would say this as Adonai. And the interpretive issue is whether this word is pronounced, whether this is a sacred Adonai or if this is just the regular Adonai. And who does it refer to? Does it refer back to God, who is singular, but is addressed in the sacred plural with the kamatz? Or does it reflect back to the three angels who he saw? And in which case, why is it written with a kamatz and not with a patak? The reason this is a dicey thing from the point of view of interpretation is that Christians read this verse as part of the proof of the Trinity. The fact that God seems to be interchanged rather regularly in this text, sometimes it's plural, sometimes it's singular, the fact that it's interchanged with the plurality, with this, not just plurality, but with a threefoldality, with a threefold presentation, this could be taken as evidence of the Trinity. I mean, particularly if this Adonai is somehow combining these two aspects, combining God who appears at the very beginning, Vayera Elav Adonai, and with V'hinei Shlosha Anashim Nitzavim Alav. And so, as when you translate this into English, you have to hedge a little bit. Does it say "my Lord" or "my lords"? The commentators also notice, and they want to make an important distinction between the visitation by the three angels to Avraham and the visitation of the two remaining angels to Lot. And we read in chapter 19, which is the very next chapter of Genesis, of this visitation. It says, Vayomer Hinena Adonai. And notice this time it's written with the patak. It's not written with the chamatz. And you could infer from this that the visitation of Lot was not the same. It was not the same level as the visitation from that Avraham had. But it's very difficult to know exactly what to do theologically about this, but this is a circumstance where somebody who's listening to a Torah reader is going to hear this name pronounced two different ways when the Torah reader is Ashkenazi. In the story of Abraham, he's going to say Adonai, and in the story of Lot, he's going to say Adonai. And so maybe there's a reason to try to make a distinction between these two forms. Rashi, going back to the story of Avraham, it's clear from this that there is a controversy about how to interpret it. And Rashi, being a very great stylist, he gives us both of those opportunities as he parses the verse. And so Rashi's comment, and he said Adonai or Adonai, depending whether you're Ashkenaz or Sephardim. The first option is that to the greatest one among them, he spoke. That is to say, he addressed them all in the language of lordship, and then he said to the leader, do not cross. So the explanation here is that when he says Adonai, he's not saying the sacred name, but he's referring to all of them. And to the greatest one, he says, don't pass over me in the singular. Because if you can convince the most important one that he needs to stay, then they're all going to stay. And if this is the language is profane. If the language is sacred in this case, then when he says Vayomar Adonai, he's asking God to wait. I mean, the three people have come before him, but God appeared even before them. So before he turns to them to take care of their needs, he is going to go back to God and say, Adonai, please wait. I'll get back to you after I perform this great mitzvah of taking care of the guest. And we learn from this how important the mitzvah of taking care of the guests are. And so the problem that we have to go across through here is that there's two ways that this can vary. It could go from plural to singular, or it could go from sacred to profane. And this distinction, as difficult as it is to make sense of theologically, or even semantically at times, requires that one pronounce very carefully the kametz when it's there to distinguish it from the patak. And so you would want to pronounce this word in particular according to the Ashkenazi custom, because it allows you to make this distinction. And this raises the particular argument with some, is that whenever we use these words, we should be careful to say them according to the Ashkenaz pronunciation. That even if somebody who speaks Sephardi the rest of the time, when he says, call up for the Aliyah, he should say, Baruch et Adonai Hamavorach. Because if you say Adonai carefully, be sure that you're saying the divine name. But if you say Adonai, You might be saying something to represent the divine, or you could just be saying that there's a plural collection of lords, a plural collection of majesty. And if you want to, and it's theologically then very dangerous. You're saying, bless the lords or bless the gods. You're committing an act of heresy when you pronounce it incorrectly. And what we're going to explore is the reflections of Rabbi Shlomo Goren on this issue. He noticed that, and he was not happy, that many of the Haredim, many of the very religious Jews that were coming of age in the later, in the last half of the 20th century, that they, even though they were brought up speaking Hebrew with the Sephardi pronunciation, and even though they would speak the rest of their prayers in their Hebrew with that pronunciation, they would pronounce the divine name of Adnot. They would say, they were careful to say Adonai instead of Adonai. And he's going to explain why he thinks that's not necessary and could in fact be a bad idea. But I want to talk a little bit first about Rabbi Shlomo Goren, because it's always good, I think, to have a sort of a feel for the people that we are studying their halakhic writings. Rabbi Goren was born in Poland. He made Aliyah with his family to the land in 1924. He's known as the chief rabbi of the military of the IDF. The story is told that when he wanted to kosher all of the military bases, have kosher food there, that Ariel Sharon told him that if he could produce a single frum paratrooper, that he would be allowed to kosher the bases. And so Rabbi Goren took up paratrooping himself, and was a commissioned paratrooper, and also broke his leg in the effort, but was permitted in the end to kosher all of the military bases. He was the third Ashkenazi chief rabbi. He's known among secular Jews, and for the fact that he was on the scene in the Six-Day War. This is a famous picture of him, I think, in front of the Dome of Rock, with a Sefer Torah and a shofar. It was taken immediately after the liberation of the old city and the Western Wall. Like all great rabbis, he managed to annoy all constituencies, but nevertheless, people had to respect him because of his great courage and because of his great learning. To those on the left, people were very angry with him because he was devoted to eventually rebuilding the temple on Har Habayit. I mean, he really felt that the buildings that are there now should be removed, and that the temple should be rebuilt, and that's something that the left would view very negatively. On the right, because he was such a strong Zionist, he would be irksome, but also he was greatly independent of the government in many of the rulings that he made. His chief halakhic works are his Tshuvot Meshiv Milchama, the great volumes of issues about Jewish law and in the military. And among those Tshuvot are a response saying that the siege of Beirut that was conducted by the IDF contradicted Jewish law because it did not give any means for the people in the city to escape, and you're required to do that. When he turns to this issue, the first thing that he brings forward is that there are a lot of different ways to pronounce Hebrew words. And this is something that we spoke of last week. It cuts against assuming that there is one pronunciation that's better than any other pronunciation. And the story that he brings as evidence for this is this famous story of the Shibboleth episode from the 12th chapter of the book of Judges. And very basically, you see on the map here that you have Gilad over here across the river and Ephraim over here. Ephraim attacked the Giladi basically because there was a war with the Ammonites that they wanted to be involved in and they weren't asked to attend. Gilad defeated them, and to prevent Ephraim from escaping, from going back across the river, the Giladites stationed guards among the fords of the river. And the test to get across was to say shibboleth, but the Ephraimites could not pronounce the shin. And so when instead of shibboleth, they would say sibboleth or something like that. And they would know that when the person said sibboleth instead of shibboleth, that they were an Ephraimite and they could kill them. But the argument here is made is that there are, even from the evidence of the scripture, there's an idea that there are different types of Hebrew, and you wouldn't want to assume that any one is better than the other. Rabbi Goren brings this very nice saying of Chaim Vital, who writes it in the Pri-Etz Chaim, which is his part of his collection of the writings of the Ari. It says there are 12 gates of prayer in the heavens, which correspond to the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's not appropriate to change one's nusach, that's to say one's pronunciation, one's form of prayer, and to cross from gate to gate. In other words, diversity in pronunciation is really part of the design. And the worst thing that you could do is try to go through somebody else's gate. That the God has set up for there to be a number of different ways to approach him, and we wouldn't want to, the only mistake that you can make then, the only wrong one, the wrong pronunciation, is when you do somebody else's. And that's precisely what these students, what these Haredim were doing in the opinion of Rabbi Goren, that they were trying to cross from one gate to the other gate, rather than, and which is not what what Hakadosh Baruch Hu would like us to do. The second argument that Rabbi Goren makes is very interesting, I think, and it's from the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed of Maimonides, which is a book that's mostly about the Hebrew language and how we square the difficult language of the Hebrew Bible, which famously involves corporality, adjectives for God, and other things that are theologically problematic. How do we square that with a philosophically refined sense of religion? And what Maimonides points out is that divine language tends to be plural, and that's not a sign of shame, but that's a sign of honor. And he writes that the difference between saying Adoni, which is formally singular, or my master, and saying Adonai, which is formally plural, is like the difference between Sari and Sarai. I mean, Sarah, before she's called Sarah, is called Sarai, which literally means it's a possessive form of Sar, or ruler. And the second, and she's called Sarai and not Sari, because if she was Sari, that would indicate that her greatness, that her mastery was just in regards to one. But we call her Sarai because this indicates that her mastery was involved with others, with more than one person, and therefore that elevates her sense of greatness. And in other words, and this is in keeping with Maimonides' approach to language, which is that language reflects more on the human beings attempting to understand God than it reflects on God himself or herself. That when we talk about God having these attributes, God is great, God is merciful. We don't believe, as a matter of philosophy, that he really possesses those sorts of attributes. But the fact that we call him those things tells us about the way humans experience him through this lens of language. And therefore, if we refer to God in a plural form, it's a matter of us expressing his greatness and honoring him, rather than making a statement about the character of God himself. The fact that we have Elohim, which refers to a singular but is in a plural form, something like that is in a plural form simply because we want to honor God. By understanding him, of having a greater sense of completeness, a greater sense of potential. And therefore, even if one is worried about distinguishing between Adonai, which is with the Kamates, which is reserved for the sacred name or the sacred plural, and Adonai, which seems to be the regular plural, the pluralness itself is not a problem. The pluralness is not heresy. The pluralness is honor. It's respecting God, and it's an element that is in all matters of language. So, having said that, there's a diversity of ways to pronounce Hebrew. Um, Even if we're worried that this one variant of Hebrew points us in the position of ascribing plurality to God, that's not what the language is doing. That it's really making God more godlike. It's making God greater. So Rabbi Shlomo, he concludes, and he makes three additional arguments. The first argument is that changing the pronunciation of Hebrew, because you think the Sephardi pronunciation leads to potential heresy, is tremendously disrespectful of all of the great Sephardi authorities of the past. You're saying that we've found an error in practice that didn't bother the Rambam, who didn't try to stop this. It didn't bother Joseph Caro. He never mentioned that we had to do this. All of these great rabbis pronounced the word with the patak the same way they pronounced it with the kametz, Adonai, and they didn't see a problem with it. Who are you to say that you have a problem? And isn't it disrespectful to say that what everyone else is doing is wrong? And this is something that we don't always think of, but perhaps we should worry about it more. There was a famous incident a few years ago. A group of Jews, I think from YU, went to Japan. And there's a controversy about whether Japan is on one side of the international date line or the other, which means that Shabbat could be either on Friday or on Saturday. Japan, they observe it on Saturday. But because of the controversy, this group of visiting students decided that on Friday as well, they were going to observe matters of the halacha of Shabbat that were forbidden biblically, and just do those things that were do the things that were forbidden rabbinically, but avoid the things that were forbidden biblically on Friday, so that they would arise from all doubt. And people pointed out correctly that this was very disrespectful of the Jewish community of Japan, which has been there, dealt with the controversy, and is decided that Shabbat is going to be on Saturday, and that's when it's observed. And to insinuate that they're sinning by not doing something on Friday as well is very disrespectful. And Rabbi Goren takes this line to say it's really very wrong to assume that you've discovered a problem that the great Sephardi authorities of Lord did not, they missed somehow, and you're here to correct it. You're here to correct it. Another interesting thing about Rabbi Goren's writings is that he does not see this simply as a protecting the custom of people who speak with the Sephardi accent because they're Sephardim. But people, wherever they come from, if you grow up in Israel speaking with the modern Israel pronunciation, which is based on the Sephardi pronunciation, that's an authentic custom. That the custom of speaking does not necessarily belong to your parents where you come from. I mean, you could not. In other words, an argument would not be, well, we're just doing what our ancestors did before they came to Israel, and started to speak with the Sephardi accent. Being in Israel and having a religious Jewish community in Israel, which has its own practices. It's a real community. And the minhag that you're obliged to follow is not the minhag of your family, where you came from, but it's the one that's taught in the Israeli schools. It's the one that you learn speaking on the street, speaking Hebrew in those interactions. And this is an example of how, he was a real Zionist. He was a real Zionist, and he thought that unlike many halakhic authorities, he felt that there was a halakhic impact to the Jewish state and to Israeli societies. Israeli society. A final point that Rabbi Goren wants to make is that you might say that, well, we're just adjusting the Sephardi custom. We're not switching to the Ashkenazi thing all the way. We're just making this little tweak to it, and therefore we don't have to be that concerned. And he said, well, look, on the one hand, there is evidence that the distinction that the Ashkenazim make in this case is a correct distinction to make. I mean, primarily you could say because it has different vowels under it. One has a kametz, one has a patak. We usually have different vowels for different pronunciations. It would be unusual for that not to be the case. Furthermore, the Yemeni pronunciation of Hebrew, Rabbi Goren concedes, is very similar to in terms of that vowel, the Yemenites also distinguish between the kametz and the patak. And therefore you might argue that, well, we're not just doing the Ashkenazi version, the Yemeni version agrees with it, and therefore it's 2 against 1. It wins. But he says that if you combine the traditions like that, you're really creating a foreign language. You're creating something that doesn't exist anywhere except in your own invention. That you've altered it, and even if there's a problem with the way that we're saying it, the fact that it's a living tradition matters. Which reminds me of the halakha that we have with the Sefer Torah. I mean, that's to say that we admit, even as a matter of halakha, that there are variations in the writing of certain words, that we don't know which one is correct. And therefore, if the Sefer Torah has a mistake in one of those words, it's not possible. We don't make the Sefer Torah possible. You're not allowed ahead of time to write a Sefer Torah and change those words to what you think they're supposed to be, because even though the scroll that you're copying from we recognize has mistakes, the scroll that you're making is still going to have mistakes, but it's not going to be like any scroll that existed before. And the combination of Sephardi and Ashkenaz is still going to have some mistakes in it, but unlike the living languages, it's going to be something that never existed before, and that's something that we would want to avoid. And so this takes us to the end of our discussions about halakhic problems with the pronunciation of Hebrew. As with the class before, I wanted to make the point that even very traditional Judaism is not something that simply conserves the past. There's a dynamic in all things, and these customs get going, and we have to decide what to do with them. The I just think that it's a fascinating thing to have to study. I will. I've talked now for 40 minutes, which is my usual what I allot myself. And I'll pause for a minute to see if there's any questions. Okay, it's good to see everyone. Next week we're going to have a live audience for this, so we'll see how that goes. And as always, I enjoy seeing all of you online.